You know those little gaps and cracks that make your home look tired no matter how much you upgrade? I finally decided to fix them, and the difference is actually shocking. Here's how I made our place look fresh and finished with one simple product. I dug out the old caulk so that I would have a nice fresh starting point. I then used Titebond Pro Grade Plus caulk in white. It's a multi-purpose siliconized acrylic latex caulk. I clipped the top off at an angle and then punctured the interior seal using the little tool here on my caulking gun. I set the Titebond in place and I was ready to get to work. I added it into the gap, filling in all of the space easily. Then I was able to pat it down using a wet paper towel and also using my finger, which was a little bit moistened. I did have a glove on. I pushed it into place a little bit so that it would have the exact kind of finish that I would like. After just 2 hours, it was fully ready to paint. So I took out my white paint and gave everything a touch-up so that it all looked nice and fresh and professionally finished. The seam was no longer noticeable. So now it was time to move on to that crack in the ceiling. I had to take out the big ladder for this one and climb my way up to the top. Using Titebond and the caulk gun, I was able to create a line right along the crack itself. I used a different tool to try to push the caulk into the space of the crack. I also used my finger because sometimes the tool was difficult to use due to the knockdown texture on my ceiling. The Titebond went in perfectly, filling up all the spaces and starting to camouflage the crack itself. I gave time for that to dry and then took out my flat white ceiling paint. Even with the paint still wet, you can see how much the Titebond has completely hidden any signs of this crack. It looks so much better and is no longer an eyesore right when you're in the living room. Now I was ready to tackle the master bedroom in a number of ways. First, I started with the Titebond in the corner. I knew I was going to paint, so I went ahead and put some painter's tape down along the bottom edges. While the Titebond was able to fill the large gap in my kitchen trim, it was also able to fill this smaller, more narrow, and more specific space that I needed filled here in the bedroom. Again, I used a damp paper towel or my finger in order to get the caulk exactly where I wanted it to go. 2 hours later, I was painting again, and then, when it was dry, I went ahead and removed the painter's tape, and it left a beautiful finish. This is the way it should have been done in the first place. Completing these projects is something I really needed to do to elevate the look of my home. It's the finishes that make the big difference. So now I was inspired to keep going and finish up this bedroom and make it look a lot better. I purchased some new sheets and pillowcases from Amazon, did some general cleanup all around. Decluttering always makes a huge difference. I added a new comforter and introduced some color with this sunflower wreath and this yellow blanket. When all of these little details come together, the house really just looks so much better and more finished. Projects like these can make you fall in love with your 20-year-old house all over again. Whether it was a large gap like the kitchen trim, a small gap like that one in our bedroom quarter round, or a thin crack in the ceiling, Titebond solved the problem for me and inspired me to make the whole house look better. Thank you, Titebond, for sponsoring this project and also for helping me fall in love with my house again. If you ever thought that wood beams would be too heavy for you to add to your ceiling or to work on yourself, I'm here to tell you that there's a trick that will make your day. The first thing I did was to determine where I wanted my wood beams to go. I centered my beams along this wall and marked the location with some painter's tape. After that, I wanted to mark a line across the ceiling to help guide me as to where the wood beam would go. I did this using a chalk line. I realized also that the crown molding needed to be cut out in order to allow the wood beams to fit into place. So I cut those out using a multi-tool, which is a handy little tool I've used in a lot of DIY projects. Once the crown molding was out of the way, I was ready for the exciting part of creating the beam. Here's where the trick comes into play. Rather than installing one heavy, solid wood beam, we created a hollow faux wood beam. There are a few ways you could do this, but what we did was to use 1x3s as our side pieces and a 1x4 for our bottom-facing piece. The reason I used 1x3s for the side pieces is because I didn't want the wood beam to hang too low into this small room. Now we need to attach this to the ceiling somehow. You'll look for ceiling joists or trusses, some way for you to attach to the ceiling itself with some supports. If you don't have wood to attach to above your ceiling, you may want to consider using toggle bolts. We cut 2x4s to the width of our U-shaped faux beam. We then attached a few of those along our guideline. Then, with each of us standing on a stepladder, we lifted our faux beam up into place. Then it was just a matter of securing these with our nail gun. We used a brad nailer because this utilizes longer nails. That's important because we're going through the 1x4 side pieces all the way to the 2x4 center piece that we had mounted to the ceiling. So we used nails that were 1.5 inches in length to be sure that we got through everything that we wanted to. Our wood was 8 feet in length, but the room was almost 16 feet across, so we actually had to join 2 sets of beams together. I added some wood putty at the seam and then sanded it down to blend the seam as best as possible. Once those went up, the room already looked transformed, but in order to finish it off, I also added a stain to the wood. You might wonder why I didn't stain the wood before I put it up on the ceiling. The reason is because I needed to join these 2 faux wood beam pieces together, and I was afraid that if I stained them before putting them up, then I might have variations in the 2 different beam pieces. This way, I was staining it in place so that I knew that I was applying the stain in a uniform motion across both of the beams that joined in the center of the room. In order to apply the stain with the wood beams in place, I simply added some painter's tape to protect the ceiling. I applied the wood stain using a lamb's wool pad rather than a paintbrush because I like that I can apply different amounts of pressure depending on whether or not I want the wood darker or lighter in that particular spot. I think that they add a great element to our room. I hope that this inspires you to add some faux wood beams where you otherwise thought you couldn't have before. If you've ever wondered what the inside of a hollow core door looks like, you're about to find out. This door was in fine shape, but when it opened, it took up all the space in the hallway, and I wanted to convert this closet to a laundry closet with a stackable washer and dryer, and having doors that open like French doors was going to be much more functional. I removed the door from the hinges and removed all of the door lock hardware. I laid it on a table to get started with my project. The next step was to go ahead and cut the door with the table saw. There was no turning back now. And then I got my first glimpse inside a hollow core door. It was hollow, with wood at the top and bottom and some cardboard in some areas. I sanded down the rough edges left from the table saw and then measured and cut my 1x2s to the height of the door. In order to add 1x2s to the end of the door, I needed something for it to attach to. So I took the wood left over from cutting down my 1x2s to the right height, and I attached these to the inside of the door using a pin nailer, since this uses just a very small nail. Once that was done, I used construction adhesive and some more nails to attach the 1x2s along the edge. Now I've got 2 door halves set up and ready. The problem is, clearly, that I also have big holes in the door due to the old lock and handle. So I had to cover those. I happened to have some leftover beadboard from a recent bathroom project, and so I decided to just turn this over and use the smooth side. You could use a panel or sheet cut down like this, or alternatively, you could use a piece of trim that you like. I cut this to 3.5 inches wide to cover the doorknob hole, and cut it thinner on the other side to cover up the seam where the 1x2 was attached to the door. I secured those in place using construction adhesive and the pin nailer. Once those were in place, I could hang the door and get a good look at everything. The next step was to paint. Finally, I added some long handles and my door was ready for use. It stays together and tight when closed, but if yours doesn't, you can add a door magnet at the top. I had bought some of these on Amazon but didn't end up needing them at all on my project. Now my closet is ready for me to add the laundry center, and the doors will allow me to open the closet without the door obstructing the entire hallway. This project could also be used on a pantry door or linen closet door really nicely. I hope this inspired you to repurpose your door to fit your needs. Here's a quick and inexpensive way to update an old mirror. I grabbed this faux wood wallpaper off of Amazon, and it cost me less than $6 for the roll. I measured the width that I needed to cut the paper in order to fully fit this kind of mirrored border that I already had on the mirror. Once I had that width, I cut strips of the wallpaper a bit wider than what I needed. Then I simply placed the paper along the border on the left-hand side. It went on smoothly and easily. Once it was positioned where I wanted it to be, I used a straight razor to cut along the mirror's edge. I did the same thing along the right-hand side of the mirror, and then I worked my way to the bottom. I measured the width that I needed, and then cut it so that I would have a little bit of overlap and a really good seam on the sides. The final piece was my installation across the top. It looked really great, it adhered easily, and then of course all I needed to do was to continue to go around it a little more just to fine-tune the edges and make sure that everything was attached and adhered in the way that I wanted it to look. I hope this inspires you to use some peel and stick faux paper to create a different look in your bathroom.